From Stride Toward Freedom by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Oppressed people deal with their oppression in three characteristic ways. One way is acquiescence. The oppressed resign themselves to their doom. They tacitly adjust themselves to oppression and thereby become conditioned to it. In every moment and every movement toward freedom, some of the oppressed prefer to remain oppressed. Almost 2,800 years ago, Moses set out to lead the children of Israel from the slavery of Egypt to the freedom of the Promised Land. He soon discovered that slaves do not always welcome their deliverers. They become accustomed to being slaves. They would rather bear those ills they have, as Shakespeare pointed out, than flee to others that they know not of. They prefer the flesh pots of Egypt to the ordeals of emancipation. There is such a thing as a freedom of exhaustion. Some people are so worn down by the yoke of oppression that they give up. A few years ago, in the slum areas of Atlanta, a Negro guitarist used to sing almost daily. Been down so long, the down don't bother me. This is the type of negative freedom and resignation that often engulfs the life of the oppressed. But this is not the way out. To accept passively an unjust system is to cooperate with that system. Thereby, the oppressed become as evil as the oppressor. Non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. The oppressed must never allow the conscience of the oppressor to slumber. Religion reminds every man that he is his brother's keeper. To accept injustice or segregation passively is to say to the oppressor that his actions are morally right. It is a way of allowing his conscience to fall asleep. At this moment, the oppressed fails to be his brother's keeper. So acquiescence, while often the easier way, is not the moral way. It is the way of the coward. The Negro cannot win the respect of his oppressor. By acquiescing, he merely increases the oppressor's arrogance and contempt. Acquiescence is interpreted as proof of the Negro's inferiority. The Negro cannot win the respect of the white people of the South or the people of the world if he is willing to sell the future of his children for his personal and immediate comfort and safety. A second way that oppressed people sometimes deal with oppression is to resort to physical violence and corroding hatred. Violence often brings about momentary results. Nations have frequently won their independence in battle. But in spite of temporary victories, violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. Violence as a way of achieving racial justice is both impractical and immoral. It is impractical because it is the descending spiral ending in destruction for all. The old law of an eye for an eye leaves everybody blind. It is immoral because it seeks to humiliate the opponent rather than win his understanding. It seeks to annihilate rather than convert. Violence is immoral because it thrives on hatred rather than love. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. It leaves society in monologue rather than dialogue. Violence ends by defeating itself. It creates bitterness in the survivals and brutality in the destroyers. A voice echoes through time saying to every potential Peter, "Put up your sword." History is cluttered with the wreckage of nations that failed to follow this command. If the American Negro and other victims of oppression succumb to the temptation of using violence in the struggle for freedom, future generations will be recipients of the desolate night of bitterness, and our chief legacy to them will be an endless reign of meaningless chaos. Violence is not the way. The third way open to oppressed people in their quest for freedom is the way of nonviolent resistance. Like the synthesis in Hegelian philosophy, The principle of nonviolent resistance seeks to reconcile the truths of two opposites, acquiescence and violence, while avoiding the extremes of immoralities of both. The nonviolent resistor agrees with the person who acquiesces that one should not be physically aggressive toward his opponent, but he balances the equation by agreeing with the person of violence that evil must be resisted. He avoids the non-resistance of the former and the violent resistance of the latter. When nonviolent resistance, no individual or group needs submit to any wrong, nor need anyone resort to violence in order to right a wrong. It seems to me that this is the method that must guide the actions of the Negro in the present crisis of racial relations. Through nonviolent resistance, the Negro will be able to rise to the noble height of opposing the unjust systems while loving the perpetrators of the system. The Negro must work passionately and unrelentingly for full stature as a citizen, but he must not use inferior methods to gain it. He must never come to terms with falsehood, malice, hate, or destruction. Nonviolent resistance make it possible for the Negro to remain in the South and struggle for his rights. The Negro's problem will not be solved by running away. He cannot listen to the glib suggestions of those who would urge him to migrate en masse to other sections of the country. By grasping his great opportunity in the South, he can make a lasting contribution to the moral strength of the nation and set a sublime example of courage for generations yet unborn. By nonviolent resistance, the Negro can also enlist all men of goodwill in his struggle for equality. The problem is not a purely racial one, with Negroes set against whites. In the end, it is not a struggle between people at all, but a tension between justice and injustice. Nonviolent resistance is not aimed against oppressors, but against oppression. Under its banner, consciences, not racial groups, are enlisted. If the Negro is to achieve the goal of integration, he must organize himself into a militant and nonviolent mass movement. All three elements are indispensable. The movement for equality and justice can only be a success if it is both a mass and militant character. The barriers to be overcome require both. Nonviolence is an imperative in order to bring about ultimate community. A mass movement of a militant quality that is not at the same time committed to nonviolence tends to generate conflict, which in turn breeds anarchy. The support of the participants and the sympathy of the uncommitted are both inhibited by the threat that bloodshed will engulf the community. This reaction in turn encourages the opposition to threaten and resort to force. When, however, the mass movement repudiates violence while moving resolutely toward its goal, its opponents are revealed as the instigators and practitioners of violence if it occurs. Then public support is magnetically attracted to the advocates of nonviolence, while those who employ violence are literally disarmed by overwhelming sentiments against their stand. From Stride Toward Freedom by Martin Luther King, Jr.